Hello everyone, this is part 3 of my series on positional sacrifice. The game which I'm going to show you is a game against Grandmaster Akobian, which I played in Gibraltar 2011, and the game won the best game prize in the tournament. So we started like this: d4, knight f6, c4, g6, f3. This move came as a surprise for me because usually Varusian played different systems against the Grunfeld, which is my main weapon with black against d4. So he wanted to surprise me with f3, and then I decided to surprise him with c5. The point is that now I want to get the Benoni type of the position with the f-pawn already on f3. So c5, d5, bishop g7, e4, d6, knight c3. So we obtained the Zamish system of the King's Indian. So it came as a surprise to both of us. And in a few moves we were already out of book and played on our own. I played the short castle, bishop g5. So I played h6, bishop e3, and then e6, preparing to play e takes d5 and transposing to the Benoni. Queen d2, e takes d5, c takes d5. Taking with the e-pawn doesn't make much sense when the pawn is on f3, because it takes away the f3 square from the white's knight. So white played c takes d5, rook e8. This is a useful move in the Benoni, and black also sets a trap. If white takes the h6 pawn, bishop takes h6. Black answers with knight takes e4. Knight takes, and queen h4 check. This is a well-known idea in the Benoni. And eventually black wins back the bishop on h6 and obtains a good position. So obviously white doesn't take on h6. Instead he played knight ge2, developing his knight bd7, and knight g3. I believe that when white has his queen on d2, the knight c1 idea is better. And you're gonna see why. When black plays h5, h4 and white's knight gets back to f1, white will have to spend time moving his queen before the knight gets to d2. And that's why when the queen is already on d2, I believe the knight c1 idea is better. Anyways, white played knight g3, h5, preparing h4, bishop e2. So white's idea is to retreat to f1. Now, anyways, h4 was a pretty good move in this position, but I decided to start with a6. My idea is to prepare b5, so I expected white to play a4, and then I would play h4. Though to my surprise, white played the short castle. So he ignores the idea of b5, but prepares to meet h4 with knight h1, which will be followed by knight f2. So I played b5. This was my idea behind a6. Now black takes some space on the queen side. And the idea of h4 is still there. Bishop h6. This is a double-edged decision. Of course, when someone has a fianchetto bishop on g7, it looks good to exchange the bishop. But if you look at the pawn structure, all white pawns are on light squares. So after the exchange of the dark squared bishops, the dark squares are gonna be weak. And so I'm not sure this exchange is good for white. And so I simply ignored white's last move and played h4. When I played h4, I had to calculate knight f5, which looks like an interesting idea. Then it seems that g takes f5 is bad because of queen g5. But in fact, that's exactly what I was going to play. Now black has a strong defensive idea on knight h5, protecting the bishop on g7 and giving back an extra piece. Queen takes h5. Queen takes. And queen f6. After the exchange of queens, black doesn't have to worry anymore about his king. And in case of queen h5, black can block the position with f4. And then he obtains a really nice square on e5 for his pieces. So I believe this position is already better for black. And so white decided to go back to h1, which I think was the correct decision. Knight h1. Knight h5. So after the exchange of the dark squared bishops, the dark squares are gonna be weak. So I want to bring my knight to f4. After the preparatory queen f6. Bishop takes g7. King takes g7. And a4. This move makes a lot of sense. White provokes a weakening of the c4 square. And in fact, I have no choice but to play b4. So b4, knight d1. So now the knight is going to c4 via e3. And I believe this is one of the critical moments of the game. If white succeeds in bringing his knight to c4, the other knight will go to f2. White brings all of his pieces and he's gonna get a really nice position. So I thought I have to do something really quick. And that's how I came to this f5 move. If you look at white's pieces in this position, you're gonna find that most of his pieces are on the last rank. The knights are really bad right now. And so I want to open up the position and to exploit the bad position of his pieces. Another good idea would be queen f6, bringing my knight to f4. So I played f5. E takes f5. I believe this move is already an inaccuracy. Probably white should have tried to keep the e file closed with knight h to f2, protecting the e4 pawn. And then the position is roughly equal. Anyways, I would prefer to play a position like this with the black pieces. In the game, white played e takes f5. And in fact, it seems that there is nothing wrong with this move. So here I started to think. When I played f5, I thought after e takes f5, I can play the simple g takes f5. The e file will be open and there is no knight e3. And so I wasn't really worried about this move. And when he played e takes f5, I realized I may have even a stronger idea. And so after some thought, I played knight b6. This move may look a little worried because it seems the knight goes in the wrong direction. The pawn on g6 is hanging, so white is going to be a pawn up, and it's not so clear what black is doing in this position. And in fact, probably the strongest move for black is queen f6, not knight b6. Then if white takes on g6, knight f4 is very strong. And black dominates. But knight b6 move is also pretty strong, and it forces white to solve serious problems. So white accepts the challenge and plays f takes g6. If he plays knight h2 f2, I can choose between g takes f5 and bishop takes f5 with a good position for black in both cases. So he played f takes g6, the principal move. Now take some time, and I hope you're gonna find the idea which occurred in the game. Rook takes e2. I was really happy when I found this idea. Once again, I want to exploit the development advantage. Since all of his pieces are really bad, I have time to bring all of my pieces with tempi to attack. And it turns out to be extremely unpleasant for white. So white has no choice but to accept the sacrifice. Queen takes e2, knight f4. My idea is to bring the queen to g5 and create a threat of mate in 1, knight h3. And already in this position, white committed a decisive mistake with queen e4. The move which seems to be the most natural one. The only defense would have been queen c2. It turns out that the queen has to stay on the second rank. Then queen g5 with a deadly threat of knight h3. Now g3 loses to bishop f5. The queen cannot go to d2 as after knight h3 check, white loses the queen. So queen b3. Knight h3 check. King g2. And now finally we see the reason why the black's knight is on b6. Knight takes d5. Suddenly the knight enters the attack with a decisive effect. The point is that knight df4 is a threat, and if queen takes d5, knight f4 check, and black wins the queen. So g3 doesn't save white, but he has a better defensive idea. g4. And in fact, this move is the only defense. against knight h3 checkmate. So now white gets the g2 square for his king. After g4, knight h3 check, king g2. I couldn't find anything better than knight f4 repeating the moves. And it's extremely dangerous for white to play for a win with king f2, because then his knight is stuck on h1, and black develops a very strong attack. So queen c2 was necessary and probably led to a draw. Instead, Jacobian played queen e4, attacking the knight on f4. Still queen g5. Now black has two threats, queen takes g2 checkmate and knight h3 checkmate. g3 is bad in view of knight b takes d5. With bishop f5 to follow. White is in trouble. So Varujan finds the only defense, g4. Knight h3 check. King g2. I have to admit that already at this point I was in the time trouble, and so I decided to repeat moves. I played knight f4, king g1, and now after winning some time on the clock, black can go on with his attack. Bishop d7. Once again, I was very happy to find this idea. It turns out that black can play this slow developing move, preparing rook e8, and white is just doomed. He has no time to bring his pieces. Knight e3. White wants to play knight f5 check. In fact, white also sets a trap. After rook e8, he played knight f5 check. And now if black goes king f6, white has a very strong move, knight takes d6. So after rook takes e4, knight takes e4 check. White wins back the queen and gets a better position. Almost a winning position. Fortunately, black doesn't have to go to f6. So I played the simple king g8. Now the only move is queen b1. In case of queen c2, black plays rook e2 with the tempo, with the following knight h3 or rook g2 checkmate. So queen b1 is forced. Knight h3 check. King g2 is the only move. Knight f4 check. Again, winning some time on the clock. King g1, knight h3 check. King g2. And finally my knight from b6 enters the game. Knight takes d5. That's why I needed my knight on b6. Now the knight is coming to f4 with the threat of checkmate. King takes h3 leads to the same checkmate, knight f4. So white played knight f2, vacating the h1 square for his king. Now in case of knight df4 check, white plays king h1, and his position might be still defendable. And so I had to find a good attacking idea, which is rook e2. pinning the knight on f2 and preventing king h1 move. Once again, king h3 runs into knight f4 checkmate. My threat is to play either bishop takes f5, and then queen takes f5 is met by knight e3 check with the following knight takes f5, or the simple knight d2 f4 check, forcing king h1 and then knight takes f2. So white played knight takes d6. Anyway, there is no defense. At least this way he stops bishop takes f5 idea. But after knight d6, I have another strong attacking idea, bishop takes g4. It turns out that the bishop is untouchable, f takes g4, queen takes g4, king h1, queen f3 checkmate. Black's threats are to play knight f4 with the following bishop takes f3, or knight e3 with the following bishop takes f3. And so white decided it's time to resign. I really enjoyed playing this game, and even my opponent said after the game that he has never lost like this. Thank you. This was Grandmaster Viktor Mikhalevsky.